The field lies silent now. But it is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of something unfinished, something watching. On certain nights, beneath a thin veil of moonlight, a shadow is said to stir too large for a stray dog, too heavy for a trick of the mist. It moves with a deliberate pace, slow at first, then sudden, as if aware of those who dare to look. In the aftermath of Antietam, the bloodiest single day of the American Civil War, soldiers left notes in their diaries, cryptic lines scrawled between accounts of battle. Some wrote of a black beast that prowled the edges of camp. Others described eyes like burning coal glinting in the darkness, fixed on them from beyond the tree line. Their words carried no embellishment, no attempt at poetry. Only the flat terror of men who had already stared death in the face and found something worse, still lingering after the guns fell silent. The locals whispered too. For years after they spoke of a hound that could not be touched, a creature that never seemed to tire. They said it would appear at crossroads or near the sunken lane, where bodies had been piled like cordwood. They said its growl could be heard but not placed a low rumble rolling across the fields like distant thunder. And that if you caught sight of its eyes, two fiery orbs in the fog, you would feel your legs weaken, your breath shorten, as though the weight of the dead pressed down upon you. No bullet ever struck it. No hunter ever claimed it. Stories spread of men who raised rifles, swore their aim was true. But when they fired, the beast dissolved into shadow, only to reappear further down the road. Some believed it was the spirit of a war dog left behind. Others insisted it was no animal at all, but a warning, an omen stitched into the very ground, where so much blood had seeped into the earth. And even now, in the quiet hours when fog settles heavy and the fields of Sharpsburg seem to breathe, there are those who claim they can still feel it. A presence, watching, waiting, guarding the ground where the dead were never truly at rest. September 1862. The small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, found itself at the center of a storm. The rolling farmland, the cornfields, the stone bridges, all of it became the stage for one of the most violent days in American history. Antietam was not merely a battle, it was a reckoning. In a single day, more than 22,000 men lay dead, wounded, or missing, Union and Confederate alike, scattered across fields that had once grown quiet crops of corn and wheat. The earth drank so much blood that witnesses said the soil itself turned black in places thick with the smell of iron and smoke. For those who lived nearby, the war did not leave when the armies moved on. The fences were splintered homes, riddled with bullet holes, barns burned to the ground. Graves were dug hurriedly in shallow earth. Horses collapsed beside their riders, left to rot where they fell. Entire fields were marked by sunken lanes soaked with bodies packed so tightly that survivors would call it the Bloody Lane. Even months later, scavenger birds circled the sky, feasting on what was left. And among all of this, the carnage, the ruin, the silence that followed, rumors began to spread. Soldiers spoke of strange feelings in the night, as if the battlefield were alive, as if the land itself carried the weight of restless spirits. Locals began to warn travelers not to linger too long near the old roads. They whispered of shapes seen in the fog, of sounds that no ordinary animal could make. In their voices lingered the conviction that something had been born that day at Antietam. Something not of flesh, but of shadow, born out of the violence, the suffering, the unfinished cries of the fallen. The name came later. Some called it the Black Hound, others the omen of Sharpsburg. But to those who believed, it was not just a story. It was a guardian, or a curse, a spectral presence that roamed where men had died in numbers too great to comprehend. The earliest mentions of the strange Black Hound at Antietam do not come from folklore pamphlets or ghost story collections. They come from the words of the soldiers themselves. In the aftermath of the battle, men who had survived the blood-soaked fields began to record their impressions in letters and diaries. Some were simple notes written in pencil on scrap paper. Others appeared in official regimental reports, hidden between the stiff language of military record. One Union private writing home in late September 1862 described a beast most unnatural in form and conduct. He claimed to have seen a dark animal pacing the edges of the campfires, its eyes glowing like cinders in the ash pit. Another officer, more skeptical, referred to the sightings as phantoms conjured by nerves frayed and bellies empty. Yet even as he dismissed them, he admitted that the stories had spread quickly among the ranks. The Baltimore Sun, in an October 1862 issue, published a curious column under the heading "Singular Occurrence at Sharpsburg." It spoke of a shadow in the likeness of a hound, reported by multiple soldiers on picket duty. Though the article was brief, it carried the tone of a reporter straining to balance between ridicule and respect for the testimony of hardened men. Perhaps the most striking record comes from a diary discovered decades later belonging to a Confederate soldier from North Carolina. His entry dated September 20th, just days after the battle, reads, "We hear the cries of the wounded still, though they be long since dead. In the fog there was seen a hound, great and black, standing near the sunken road. His eyes did burn like fire, and he did not flee when approached. Some said he waited for command, others that he marked the place for death. None would go nearer." The language is stark unembellished, written in the same hand that recorded rations, orders, and weather. To the historian, this entry is an artifact of grief, shock, and exhaustion. But to those who believe the words are proof. Civil War surgeons and chaplains, too, left their own notes. Reverend William McCarter, who served with the Irish Brigade, wrote of Antietam, "The cries of the men were ghastly, and many swore they saw shapes in the mist. One spoke of a dog of enormous size, watching as though waiting for the dying to pass." McCarter offered no explanation, no judgment. He left the sentence standing unfinished, dangling in the fog of his own memory. Reports continued into the years after the war. Local farmers spoke of their dogs refusing to enter the old cornfield, where the bloody lane had run red. Visitors from nearby towns claimed to see paw prints in the soil far larger than any hound could leave. An 1880 county history of Washington County mentioned in passing the spectral animal of Sharpsburg, though it described it with the caution of a writer unwilling to be laughed out of respectable society. Piece by piece, the record builds not in the language of legend, but in the flat, restrained voice of soldiers, reporters, preachers, and farmers. It is this that makes the Black Hound of Antietam so unsettling. For it does not come to us dressed in fairy tale garb, nor in the language of tavern superstition. It emerges instead from journals, newspapers, and the recollections of men for whom invention was the last thing on their minds. And yet, the words repeat again and again, a great black dog eyes aflame, pacing the ground where the dead lay thickest. A presence not easily dismissed. The official records tell a version that feels cold, clipped, restrained. But in the quiet spaces left behind, a different voice began to speak. The voice of folklore, of whispers exchanged in kitchens and on front porches, of warnings given in the dim glow of lantern light. The Black Hound of Antietam, the people said, was no simple stray. It was not of flesh. It was something born when the ground itself split beneath the weight of death, when the air thickened with screams, when the souls of men could not find rest. Old farmers described hearing its howl roll across the valley like a storm. Not the thin, sharp cry of a hound chasing prey, but a deep and resonant sound, long and drawn out, like the groan of the earth itself. "It makes the bones rattle," one farmer was said to mutter, "and it follows you home." Travelers claimed the howl was sometimes distant, echoing from the ridges, and sometimes impossibly close, so near that they swore they felt the warm breath of a beast on the back of their necks. Yet, when they spun around the road behind them, it was empty. Parents used the tale as warning. "Be home before dark," they told their children, "or the black dog will find you." The bloody lane, where the fighting had been thickest, became not just a landmark of history, but a forbidden place. Children dared one another to walk there at twilight. Those who did often ran back within moments, pale and trembling, insisting that something had moved in the fog, that a pair of eyes, red-burning unblinking, had fixed on them. Others believed differently. Some veterans who returned to visit the battlefield decades later said the Hound was a guardian. They told hushed stories of walking the fields at night alone and feeling a strange calm when they glimpsed a shadow by the tree line. To them, the beast was no curse, but a sentinel protecting the resting places of the dead. "It watches," one veteran was heard to say, "so the boys can sleep." But superstition often bends toward fear. Local lore held that if the Hound chose to cross your path, it was not a blessing, but a warning that misfortune or death would soon follow. Families passed down stories of relatives who had seen the Hound and fallen ill within days, or of travelers who vanished after claiming to hear its padded steps in the mist. By the 1880s and 1890s, storytellers had woven the Black Hound into a tapestry of battlefield phantoms. Gettysburg, they said, had its riderless horse. Shiloh had its phantom drummer boy, and Antietam had the dog. An elderly woman interviewed in 1897 whispered that the Hound was not unique at all. She claimed there was one for every place where war had left the ground soaked in blood. "You may not see them," she said, "but they are their dogs of war born to guard what men cannot." Strange signs added fuel to the fire. Hunters spoke of paw prints discovered in frost, each larger than a man's hand. Soldiers' descendants claimed that their own dogs refused to set foot in certain corners of the battlefield, pulling at their leashes, whining hackles raised. And there were tales of lanterns, suddenly extinguished on windless nights, of travelers who saw a vast shadow fall across the moonlit ground, moving faster than anything of flesh could move. Visitors came in search of it, curious tourists, thrill-seekers, skeptics, determined to prove the tale false. Most returned with nothing more than the chill of the fog and the oppressive silence of the fields. But a few left with stories etched deep in their eyes, a glimpse of a form moving where there should have been none. A growl that came from everywhere and nowhere, the certainty that something had walked alongside them in the dark. And so the legend deepened. The Black Hound of Antietam became not just a ghost story, but a symbol of the war's violence, of the blood that would not wash away, of the souls that seemed to linger. Fact and folklore fused together so tightly that one could no longer say where truth ended and superstition began. And maybe that is why the story endures. Because when the fog rises from the fields and the air grows heavy with silence, one can almost believe that something still waits there, pacing slowly, eyes aflame, guarding the place where thousands fell and never truly left. Legends never exist in isolation. They have a way of echoing, repeating themselves across landscapes touched by the same violence. The Black Hound of Antietam may feel unique to the Maryland hills, but when one steps back and listens to the wider chorus of stories, a motif emerges, dark, persistent, timeless. Consider Gettysburg fought less than a year after Antietam. Visitors to those rolling fields have long spoken of strange figures and sounds after dusk. But the one tale that surfaces most often is of a riderless horse hooves pounding in the night, the shape of a war horse galloping across the moonlit ridges. Veterans swore they heard it. Local farmers found no hoofprints in the grass the following morning. The beast seemed to appear only when the fog lay thick, only when the battlefield was utterly still. Some called it the spirit of a general's mount. Others said it was an echo of all the horses that fell charging blind into musket fire. To the people who told the tale, Gettysburg's phantom horse carried the same weight Antietam's Hound did, a reminder of war's unfinished business. Travel farther south to Shiloh, Tennessee, and you will hear another sound, the faint, steady beat of a drum. Men who fought there in 1862 wrote of hearing it at night after the slaughter, even when no drummer boy remained alive. The rhythm would come from deep in the woods, drawing soldiers to follow. And when they did, they always found themselves back at the burial trenches where thousands lay. They called it the Phantom Drummer Boy, a child soldier locked in eternal duty, keeping time for the dead. It is not a dog, not a beast of fire and shadow, but it serves the same purpose, the same motif. The living hear it, and they remember. Across the ocean, on Europe's old fields, the motif persists. At Waterloo, villagers told of a spectral horse that wandered the ridge forever, searching for its rider. At the Somme in France, tales emerged of enormous black dogs with eyes like coal padding silently among the graves of the trenches. And in Britain, centuries before the Civil War, there was already the legend of the Black Shuck, a monstrous hound that stalked the countryside, its burning eyes seen as an omen of death. To English ears, the stories from Maryland sounded familiar. The Antietam Hound was nothing new. It was an old ghost, given new soil to haunt. Even in more modern wars, echoes arise. Soldiers in the First World War spoke of shadowy shapes seen crawling along the trench lines at night, too large, too fast to be dogs. In the Second World War, paratroopers landing in Normandy told of hearing a howl in the hedgerows, though no hounds were kept near the drop zones. Always the same image, always the same dread. Something black, something watching something that seems to walk in step with death. Patterns emerge, and with them questions. Why do these legends take such similar forms across centuries, across continents? Why is it always the hound, or the horse, or the drummer? Why do the dead seem to require guardians? Spectral beasts, or phantom sounds to mark the ground where they fell. Some folklorists suggest these tales are the mind's invention, a way to shape grief into story. When faced with mass death, the living create watchmen in the mist, dogs, horses, children to explain the weight in the air, the pressure on the chest, the sense of being observed. But others believe differently. They see a thread woven through time, a truth that war itself breeds shadows, and that the earth, when saturated with blood, calls forth its own guardians. Antietam's Black Hound, Gettysburg's riderless horse, Shiloh's drummer, the Black Shuck of Britain, the phantom beasts of Verdun, and the Somme all stand as variations of the same presence. Whether omen, curse, or protector, they mark the ground where human suffering reached its peak. The bridge is undeniable. Where war leaves its scars, legends rise. Not as scattered random tales, but as a recurring pattern, as if humanity itself cannot walk away from carnage without imagining a sentinel left behind. Perhaps imagination is all it is, or perhaps something darker follows us into every war, waiting to take shape in whatever form the land requires. And so, Antietam's Hound is no longer just Antietam's. It belongs to the long history of battlefields, haunted by beasts and omens. A story that begins in the fog of Sharpsburg, but extends to every soil stained red with blood. The first wave of testimonies was unsettling enough. But the decades that followed produced stranger, more conflicted accounts that wavered between sober documentation and whispered folklore, as though the line between the two had dissolved. Take, for instance, the case of the Pennsylvania soldier's journal discovered in 1884, tucked away in a family attic. The entries around Antietam are routine at first lists of rations, notes on weather observations of the march. But on September 19th, 3 days after the battle, a curious line appears. The dog again tonight, too large to be mortal. Its eyes make the corn glow. He never mentions it again, but the entry is underlined twice, the only emphasis in the entire book. Historians debate whether this was metaphor-fevered exhaustion or a literal sighting. For believers, it is evidence that the legend had already begun to take root in the soldier's own words. Newspapers, too, return to the subject in odd ways. An 1871 piece in the Hagerstown Mail referred obliquely to phantoms upon the field, seen by a group of boys cutting through the old lanes after dark. They described a massive hound that passed without sound and disappeared into the mist, leaving no tracks in the soft earth. The paper published the story in its Curiosities column, sandwiched between local fair announcements and a bizarre tale of a two-headed calf. Yet as trivial as the placement was, the description lingered. Folklore accumulated. One strand of local superstition claimed that the black hound appeared most often in September near the battle's anniversary, as though the ground itself remembered. Families told stories of lanterns going dark without warning of travelers, paralyzed by the sudden sight of glowing eyes on the ridge of farmers, finding paw prints pressed into new snow and ending abruptly, as though the beast had leapt into the air and vanished. Conflicting testimony makes the mystery sharper, not weaker. In 1902, a schoolteacher claimed she had seen a large dog while walking home past the battlefield at dusk. Her account was calm, methodical, almost clinical. She insisted it was not a spirit at all, but a stray animal that happened to prowl the same haunted ground. Yet when asked why she froze in terror at the sight, why she described the eyes as unnaturally bright like lamplight, her explanation faltered. Others in town whispered that she had seen the hound, though she herself refused to admit it. A Civil War relic hunter in the 1920s described something far more bizarre. While searching the bloody lane for artifacts, he claimed to have discovered a rusted bayonet wedged between stones. As he bent to pry it loose, a growl, deep, guttural vibrating, rose behind him. He turned, expecting to see a farm dog. Instead, he found nothing but fog, and two prints in the soil pressed deep, larger than his hand. He fled, leaving the bayonet behind. In a letter written years later, he confessed, "I should have stayed, but my body betrayed me." The fear was absolute, as if I had stepped into a grave. Each account stands apart yet together. They form a patchwork of dread. The hound becomes not just a ghost story, but a living rhythm of the land, appearing in testimony, vanishing in ridicule, resurfacing in whispers, always half hidden, half believed. What makes these stories so powerful is not their certainty, but their contradictions. Some call the hound an omen of death, a beast that seeks the living. Others insist it is a sentinel protecting the rest of the fallen. Some say it is flesh and blood, an animal twisted by war. Others believe it is nothing less than the embodiment of grief, a shape stitched from sorrow and memory. The truth is never pinned down. Instead, the stories breathe in the liminal space between fact and folklore, testimony and superstition. They create a tapestry where every detail, every diary entry, every newspaper clipping, every whispered warning feels like another stitch in a haunting too vast to dismiss. And so the Black Hound of Antietam endures. In official records, it is absent. In folklore, it is everywhere. And in that tension, in that uncertainty, the legend finds its power, half documented, half dreamed, all the more terrifying for what cannot be proven and what cannot be forgotten. The legend builds slowly through testimony and folklore until the weight of the stories presses into something darker, something that refuses to stay hidden in whispers. And it is here, in the uneasy space between record and superstition, that the most chilling accounts emerge. One such tale comes from 1932, when the battlefield had long since been preserved as a national park. A caretaker responsible for patrolling the grounds at night reported an incident he never spoke of publicly, but which surfaced years later in his family's papers. He described walking the bloody lane by lantern light, checking the fences and monuments when the flame guttered, though no wind stirred. In that silence, he felt the ground tremble faint, rhythmic, like padded steps. He raised his lantern, and for the briefest moment swore he saw a hound of enormous size standing in the path ahead. Its eyes glowed as if two coals had been lifted from a blacksmith's forge. The caretaker dropped the lantern, and by the time he scrambled to retrieve it, the hound was gone. Yet in the dirt where the lantern had fallen were prints impossibly deep, impossibly large. He fled, and never again walked that path after nightfall. Artifacts, too, began to vanish in strange ways. In 1957, a small group of amateur historians claimed to have unearthed a belt buckle near the cornfield. They wrapped it carefully in cloth, setting it aside while they continued to dig. When they returned only minutes later, the cloth lay empty. The buckle was gone. Their lantern flickered, and one of them swore he heard a low growl circling the edge of the field. They left shaken, never recovering the piece. Decades later, in retelling the story, one of the men suggested the Hound had taken it guarding the relics of the dead as its own. Other accounts veer into the impossible. In the 1970s, a historian conducting oral interviews with Sharpsburg residents collected the testimony of an elderly farmer who had grown up near the battlefield. He recalled seeing the Hound in his youth around 1915. He claimed that as he watched, the beast padded silently toward the old stone bridge. But when it reached the center, it simply faded, dissolving into the air as though it had never been. The farmer remembered clutching the rail, convinced his heart would stop from the sight. His voice on the tape cracked with age, but the fear remained as raw as if it had happened yesterday. The contradictions become the climax of the mystery. A 19th century diary entry describes glowing eyes pacing the fog. A 20th century park worker swears he saw paw prints pressed into the soil. Tourists whisper of lanterns, extinguished relic hunters, of artifacts vanishing. None of these accounts agree in detail, and yet taken together, they weave an image too consistent to ignore a black hound always present where the battle had been fiercest, always appearing just at the edge of perception, always dissolving before proof can be claimed. And perhaps most unsettling are the testimonies that never saw print, never appeared in official records, but passed in private letters or late-night confession. Letters from soldiers' descendants who admitted that their fathers had seen something on the field and swore never to return. A note from a Union veteran discovered folded into a Bible, claiming the dog walks still. It walked beside me, though I did not invite it. There is a motif that repeats in these final, most chilling accounts. Things vanish. The lantern that failed. The relic that disappeared. The beast itself dissolving into the mist. What remains are only the marks, the paw prints, the whispered words, the unfinished sentences in diaries. It is as though the Hound's very nature is to erase, to consume, to remind the living that war leaves scars not only on the earth, but on the stories we try to keep straight. And so the climax rises. In the dark of the bloody lane, in the fog over the cornfield, in the silence of the sunken road, the Hound is said to appear, and when it does, nothing remains quite as it was. The artifacts vanish, the stories fracture, the witnesses stumble, and the legend grows stronger. A beast with eyes of fire born of the dead, walking where history and haunting converge. The Black Hound of Antietam remains unproven, unclaimed, but never forgotten. It moves at the edge of history just beyond the reach of explanation. Diaries end in unfinished sentences. Relics vanish into nothing. Testimonies contradict, overlap, dissolve into fog. And yet, the story persists. Year after year, generation after generation, the Hound returns in whispers. Walk the battlefield at dusk, and you will understand why. The cornfield bends in a low wind, though the air is still. The sunken lane glows faintly in the last light of evening, the ground uneven, heavy, as if it still remembers the weight of the fallen. The bridge sits in silence, its stones damp with mist, its arches dark like open mouths. In those hours when the fog rises, it is not hard to believe that something else is walking too. Something pacing, where thousands died. Something that refuses to let the living forget. Is it a guardian, a curse, a shadow born of grief and memory? Or is it something older? Something that waits for blood, that always follows war, that always takes the shape we fear most. A horse at Gettysburg, a drummer at Shiloh, a black dog at Antietam. Patterns repeating stories bleeding into one another as though war itself has its own dark memory and its own dark beasts. Perhaps the Hound is not real. Perhaps it is only the imagination of men who had seen too much, who carried their nightmares into waking life. But then, how do you explain the prints in the soil? The lanterns that die without warning? the artifacts that vanish in plain sight? How do you explain the eyes burning like coals, seen by those who swore they were not believers, until the moment they froze in terror? The questions remain unanswered, and maybe they are meant to remain. For legends thrive not in certainty, but in doubt, in the silence of what cannot be explained, in the fog that blurs the line between history and haunting. So if you ever walk the fields of Antietam, if you find yourself alone, the mist curling low to the ground, the evening heavy with silence, listen carefully. Watch the edges of the corn. Look toward the ridges. You may feel it before you see it. The steady rhythm of unseen paws. The weight of eyes fixed upon you. The breath of something that should not be there. And if you do see it, if the black hound turns its fiery gaze toward you, remember this: no bullet has ever struck it. No hunter has ever claimed it, and no one who has truly seen it has ever been the same again. You've just heard another file from Classified Chronicles. If you want to dive deeper into history's forgotten mysteries, its shadows and legends, subscribe and stay with us. For the past is never as silent as we think, and some stories will always walk beside us.